Open your eyes to the world of today. Believe not the lies that they always say. Look for the truth and swallow your pride. For things that you thought that didn't exist, that you might find.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, dear viewers, to another segment of the Pool of Ideas. And as the title suggests, this is a discussion on a variety of ideas, a variety of ideologies that have affected the world, in particular the Muslim world, over the last 100 years. Dear viewers, in this particular program, we're going to be looking at terrorism and its influence and its effects across the world as well. And also, I'd like to remind you that these ideologies are very important that we understand them, maybe not so much in depth, but even if we get an overview of these ideologies, it will help us to understand the events that are taking place around the world today. So let me begin by introducing to you our very special guest, and then we'll go into our questions. If I can begin by introducing Dr. Junaid Khalifah, I'd like to welcome you to our program. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Okay, Doctor, so we've discussed a number of ideologies, and today is the big word, terrorism. Can I ask you to define for us what is meant by terrorism?
Terrorism is, according to the common dictionary definition, is using of violence to achieve political aims.
Okay.
Like when certain parties use violence and terrorism to make governments agree to do certain things or release certain prisoners.
Okay.
So violence and terrorism is not just violence for its own sake. It is violence to pressure governments or bodies or an institution to do certain things the terrorists want to achieve.
Okay, so with a political agenda in mind?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Can I also ask you to talk about the different types of terrorism, like an individual may go out and commit an act of terror, or on a state level? What's the difference between the two?
There's a big difference because we usually tend to condemn violence and terrorism done by small groups or done by individuals. But we do not recognize violence done by states as terrorism.
Okay.
And that's a contradiction in terms, because violence against innocent people, civilians, under the cover of law or legitimacy is very much the same violence done by extremist groups or individuals who have certain political aims.
Okay.
So here we have to stop and think about this. Why don't we call state violence terroristic?
Okay, excellent. And also, Doctor, before we look at some of the the climate today with regards to terrorism, I would like to go back in history a little bit and look at some of the origins of terrorism. When we look at the Crusaders, which lasted many years, could we talk about the connection between the Crusaders and terrorism, please?
It would be a very old example of how state aggression is involved in the idea of terrorism. Because the Crusades caused a lot of dead among Muslims in Jerusalem and in Muslim countries. And even the Crusaders going through some of the European countries which were Christian, they looted and killed Christians. Okay? So basically here the violence unleashed by the Crusades did not even recognize that the Christians have their rights. The commonality of being a Christian. So basically, violence committed in the Crusades is a good example of state terrorism.
Okay.
Yeah.
And also, could I ask about, you mentioned that it's for a political gain, for some kind of cause. So if we look at the years, the hundreds of years of Crusaders going into the Muslim world, what was their agenda and what did they want to achieve politically?
Actually, the Crusades came as a reaction to Muslim expansion into territories which were formerly Christian. So it was a reaction, a military reaction against the spread of Islam. It wanted to use violence and force to stop the spread of Islamic ideas.
And when you say the spread of Islam, at this particular time, when Islam spread, did it also use the same level of violence and aggression for their political means?
Islam was not aiming at political control or material gain, because basically if you look at the examples of countries where Islam entered without any wars, like places in Asia and Indonesia and so on, it was through trade that Islam spread. And that's a good example of how Islam spread. And secondly, Islam, the violence involved in wars was not aimed at non-combatants.
Okay.
It wasn't aimed at young people who are not fighting, or boys or girls or women or old people or people in their churches. It didn't, for example, as well, aim at destruction of the place.
Okay.
You don't uproot a tree. You don't spoil the lands. Or I mean, you do not use aggression, extensive aggression to spread Islam. You are fighting people who are fighting you.
Okay, Doctor, so is it fair then to say that if we look in history that Islam has not been connected with terrorism whatsoever, whereas if we look at Christianity, there is a deep history with it being connected with terrorism?
Yeah, it has a deep history of connection to terrorism and violence. If you look at the Protestant minority in the 16th century France, in 16th century France, you'll find that they were massacred because they are religiously different.
Okay.
And that's a case of terrorism based on religion.
Okay.
On that people who are different. And in this case, it was as well for political control.
Sure.
The authorities did not want people who were Protestants and whose allegiance was to people outside France.
Okay. And
so it was a means of controlling populations by ensuring conformity to a specific belief system.
Okay.
Catholicism.
And Doctor, if we move over from France and just go south a little bit to Spain, and we look at when Muslims were ruling Spain and Andalusia, and when their rule came to a demise, we find that once again Christian powers massacred lots of Muslims and Jews. Is that also considered to be a form of terrorism?
Yeah, it's basically because it wants to terrorize population in order to empty the lands, or to terrorize populations so they no longer want to stay in the territories.
Okay, excellent. Now let's move forward a little bit. We've had a look at the Crusaders, we've had a look at Andalusia as well. And we're looking at the modern world now where we have nation states. Does nationalism play a role when it comes to terrorism?
Actually, in modern times, nationalism it should be looked at as an evil idea, because it divides people into nation states according to religion, language, and other features, denying the commonality of what is human. Okay, for example, if you look at Serbian nationalism, it caused so much damage to Muslims it has caused the death of 200,000 Muslims in Bosnia.
Okay.
So basically, nationalism uses violence to exterminate whole territories.
And Doctor, you mentioned Serbia and the massacre of Srebrenica, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Why is this genocide not spoken about so openly, unlike the other Holocausts that have taken place in our history?
First, because Israel doesn't want anybody to talk about a Holocaust and compare it to others, to other modern Holocaust and genocide. It wants to remain the only victim in modern times or history. And the scale of the crime of the Serbians has been subdued because basically European countries were involved in a conspiracy of silence.
Okay.
Even the Dutch brigade, which was supposed to protect Srebrenica, did not intervene in the killing of 12,000 Muslim men and boys as young as 12 years old.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are videos that one can see of how Muslim men were lined up and taken away to be executed.
According to UN estimates, 8,000 Muslim men were massacred in Srebrenica, and according to the normal, what we really know is 12,000 Muslim men were massacred.
Okay.
In an enclave that that was supposedly protected, declared or designated a protected place.
And Doctor, this killing, this massacre, or I would even call it a Holocaust of the Serbian people, was all under the name of nationalism. Is that right?
Yeah, they were aiming for the greater Serbia, and they wanted to take all the Muslim territories and include them in the greater Serbia project.
Okay.
And basically that takes us back to to the idea of fascism.
Okay.
Nationalism could turn into ultranationalism, that and have expansionist ideologies, which usually run against the real geographical and demographic idea.
Okay.
Serbia was not great. There were Muslims in millions as well. So to trample, to create their nationalist utopia, they had to use violence to alter facts on the ground.
Okay. So, Doctor, why is it such that when states, or you can call them gangs, when they commit a state-level terrorism, it's not labeled as terrorism? But if a sole man does something which is obviously incorrect, but very easily the media will call it terrorism. Why is there that double standard?
The double standard because each society or country views itself as the source of truth and propriety. And basically, whatever it does that to protect its citizens and against others, okay? So, and others try to resist by using violence. So terrorism is never an easy term to pinpoint because it's somebody's terroristic act is another person's freedom fighter.
Okay, excellent. Doctor, let's take a short break here, and then when we come back in part 2, we'll continue talking about terrorism, but more importantly, terrorism in the modern world today.
Yeah.
Okay. Dear viewers, let's take a very short break here. We're going to, when we come back, we're going to have a look at terrorism and have a look at the influence of it in the modern world and how it's been abused as well for states to go and invade or evade other countries as well. So let's take a short break, and we will see each other in just a few moments.
Open your eyes to the world of today. Open your eyes to the world of today.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back, dear viewers, after taking a short break and joining us on our fantastic program, The Pool of Ideas, where we're breaking down different ideologies and try to summarize them in a very comprehensive manner and at the same time giving them an Islamic overview. Just before the break, we were looking at terrorism. Let's continue with our discussion with the doctor. Doctor, you mentioned a very, very beautiful phrase there, which is widely used, that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Can I ask you to pick up from that phrase, please?
For example, some Western countries would talk about Hamas as a terrorist organization, while in reality, that's an Israeli attitude. They would condemn Hamas, small missiles, ineffective, would call that terrorist. But Israel, when Israel starts a full-fledged war against Hamas or against Gaza and kills hundreds of people, this is never called terrorism. It's called Israel has a right to protect its security. So terrorism here is not a definitive idea. While in the Arab and Muslim countries, they would view whatever Hamas is doing as fighting for to protect Palestinians and to defend themselves against Israeli continued aggression. So we cannot really. So terrorism is even an ephemeral idea, as we said, because America would consider, for example, Britain used to consider the South African
Nelson Mandela
as a terrorist, right?
Sure.
But like 30 years, he is celebrated as a freedom fighter.
Okay.
So basically, terrorism or designation of a country or a place or a person as terroristic is the outcome of political expediency, rather than as a real thing. So expediency defines someone as terrorist, but when, for example, let us go back, for example, during the Taliban fight with the Russians
Okay.
in Afghanistan.
Sure.
The Taliban were celebrated in America as freedom fighters. They were provided with weapons. Okay. Now the Taliban are terrorists, right? They're doing the same stuff, which is resisting Americans. So basically, terrorism becomes a matter of expediency. It is something ready which you use against your enemies.
Okay.
So when you want to attack your enemies, to soil their, tarnish their reputation, you talk about them as terrorists. Terrorists, and as such, terrorism isn't really, it's difficult to, because it's a matter of perspective.
So it's subjective, depending on the person who's, the angle in which you're looking at.
Yeah, but we can take exception to one important thing. It's
Sure.
Terrorism is terrorism when it attacks civilians.
Okay.
Unsuspecting civilians in Afghanistan attacked by what we call
The drone attacks? Or?
drone attacks in Pakistan, and where, for example, it kills 1,000 civilians
Okay.
just to target 12 people.
Okay.
So far, 1,000 or more civilians not related to terrorism were killed in campaigns that wanted to kill like 20, that killed 20 suspected terrorists.
Okay.
So basically, the problem here is terrorism becomes just a rhetoric of the powerful.
Okay.
But as I said, we can take exception that any violence, whether done by individuals or states, and targets civilians not involved in any hostile activities,
Okay.
be those civilians in 9/11 or civilians in Afghanistan or Pakistan, civilians anywhere in the world, they should be out of it, out of a violence that doesn't, they've done nothing to earn it.
Okay. And also, Doctor, I would like to get your opinion on terrorism being used as a tool for political gains. What do I mean by that is, if you look at United States, how they managed to invade Afghanistan and how they managed to invade Iraq was on the basis that they were attacked, that terrorism was brought to their soil.
Yeah.
So how do states make use, I should say, of terrorism to invade other countries?
Actually, states not only use terrorism, they instigate terrorism, and in order to fight under false flags, in order to fight a certain country.
Okay.
For example, Iraq was given ultimatums. They were more or less accused of things which were not proved right. There were no evidence Iraq had any weapons of mass destruction. There was no evidence Iraq has any relationship with Al-Qaeda. There were, Iraq was a totally secular country, not involved in anything related to terrorist by extremist groups like Al-Qaeda. So basically, that's a problem. Terrorism was used as a mantra. It's a mantra. It's a word that is used to target certain countries that go against the wishes of America. American politics.
And you find as well, Doctor, that whenever there is a political campaign or there is any kind of an issue in the media will always take the first step they will use to accuse the other opponent would be to say he has terrorist tendencies or he is soft towards terrorists.
Yeah, if you don't condemn terrorism, if you don't condemn Hamas, if you don't condemn certain actions, you are with the terrorists.
Okay.
And this Manichaean attitude by Bush, who said, if you're not on our side, you're against us. So it's
okay, great. Also, I would like to have a look at now the consequences of terrorism. When a country is hit with terrorism, there is a number of losses that or consequences that occur. From amongst those is the tourism industry is usually hit very hard. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, Egypt is a good example. There was a bombing of a Russian airplane in Sharm el-Sheikh, and it caused the death of 250 Russian as well as other people from other nationalities. And this has totally single-handedly made Sharm el-Sheikh Westerners free. Most of the tourism now in Sharm el-Sheikh and these places are the tourists are Egyptians. and this has caused a very big damage to Egyptian tourism in terms of income in hard currencies like the dollars, which is totally needed by the Egyptian government to buy important stuff.
Okay, so terrorism doesn't just affect people politically, but also it can affect the
Economically,
country economically.
yeah.
Okay.
Actually, whoever did it, he did it with intended aim of shutting down Egyptian tourism.
Okay, right. Also, we've looked at international terrorism, one country attacking another country, or a group attacking a country. But also we have the concept of domestic terrorism, where people inside of the country are attacking each other, or states, or whatever. Can I ask you to talk about domestic terrorism?
Domestic terrorism could be the result of certain rulers, or when you have what we call a dictatorial ruler. He doesn't allow opposition to express themselves freely, and the consequence is those who cannot speak freely resort to violence as a means of letting off or making their cause known to the government.
Okay. Doctor, also I would like to talk about terrorism from a different angle as well. Many a times Muslims are accused of terrorism, say a Muslim terrorist, Islamic terrorist. This is what you find in the media. But the reality is that whenever there is a terrorist attack anywhere, the biggest losers of that are Muslims.
Yeah, and what is happening in Syria is a good example.
Okay.
ISIS has killed more Muslims than but single-handedly.
Okay.
So they attacked one or two Western countries and left like 20 or 30 people dead, but it killed hundreds of Muslims in Syria.
Okay. And also, Doctor, don't you find it a little bit suspicious whenever in the media and any event takes place in any country, within half an hour they claim that ISIS has claimed responsibility, then the West finds that they have the green light to go into a Muslim country and then to carpet bomb another 100 or 1,000 people?
That's a problem, is using individual violent acts to justify killing other innocent people is never right. If you 9/11, the 3,000 people who died in 9/11 do not even come near a fraction of the millions, 2 million Iraqis who were innocent people who died as a result of America's desire to revenge, regardless of who was responsible for the attacks.
Okay. Doctor, because of the terrorism being a very hot topic, especially in this day and age, what advice would you give to Muslims on how they can deal with the issue of terrorism?
First, Muslims should support tolerant groups, civil society that use peaceful means of political involvement, and should denounce violence.
Okay.
Because killing civilian people will not advance Islam's cause. It brings more hardship than good.
Okay. And Doctor, what advice would you give to a place like you mentioned before about domestic terrorism in a country where people are not able to express themselves, the government doesn't allow opposition? So in that case, people may tend to resort to their emotions rather than using their minds. What advice would you give them?
This is wrong. We shouldn't really, we should always be rational under the worst circumstances, because being emotional is going to produce more trouble, more death, more destruction than good.
Okay. And also, Doctor, whenever there is a terrorist activity around the world, Muslims tend to come out and condemn it immediately and apologize, I should say, sorry. They come out and apologize for the event immediately. I mean, does apologizing for every act take place? Does it benefit us as Muslims, or does it always put us in the defensive position?
We're in a defensive position. That's a reality of our times. But condemning violence is a good idea. It is never a bad idea, because it shows to other people that we are Muslims, we're standing our ground, and we're not allowing other people to hijack Islam and kill innocent civilians in our name.
Okay.
No, it's like not in our names. You don't kill in our names.
Okay.
Islam is about peace. It's not about violence.
Sure. And but what about the concept of apologizing? So if some
not apologizing, just issuing a statement, sympathizing with victims and their offering condolences and our regrets for the dead. It's just a very normal human reaction to tragedy, regardless of who did it.
Okay, excellent. Doctor, we've come to the end of this particular segment. I'd like to thank you very much to talk about such an important subject like terrorism, and also I'd like to thank you for making your way to the studio and sharing with us with your thoughts and your knowledge.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Dear viewers, we've come to the end of this particular episode of the Pool of Ideas, and we had to look at the concept of terrorism. Now, one must be aware, one must be intelligent, and one must be able to evaluate the situations that are put in front of him and not jump the gun. One should understand who is behind these events, who is the beneficiary of any particular event that takes place in the world, and not immediately jump on and start pointing fingers at Muslims, pointing fingers at particular groups and states. Just have a think about who is really behind these events and who is really benefiting. Dear viewers, on that note, we will conclude our program for today, and we'll hopefully see you in our upcoming episode of the Pool of Ideas. But until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Open your eyes to the world of today. Believe not the lies that they always say. Look for the truth and swallow your pride. For things that you thought that didn't exist, that you might find.